Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Caitlin, and on this channel I upload all sorts of content revolving around true crime, psychology and education related topics. And I do also have a second channel where I upload sort of beauty, fashion and lifestyle content that I used to upload on this channel, but it's all over there now. So today I'm back with another unsolved true crime case, and for today's video we're going to be discussing the case known as the Indiana Dunes trio, 3 women that disappeared, and there's a lot of mystery around it even to this day. So if you'd like to hear the details about this case, then keep on watching, but as always I'm just going to zoom through my regular disclaimer that I like to include at the start of all my videos, just letting you guys know that I'm not claiming to be an expert in this case or any of the other cases that I cover over on my channel. I'm simply relaying the information I'm able to find myself through research of certain sources on the internet, and because only certain sources are accessible to me, it means I may get things wrong, leave things out or mispronounce things, and I apologise if I do any of those things. I'm not trying to cause anyone any harm or an injustice, I'm simply working with the information that I have available to me. So with all that being said, we should just go ahead and get started discussing the case of the missing Indiana Dunes trio. So as I said, this case refers to the disappearance and the missing status of 3 women, and these women's names were Renee Bruhl, Patricia Blau, I apologise if I mispronounce, and Anne Miller in 1966. So just a little bit of information about each of these women before we do get into the details of the actual disappearance itself. Renee Bruhl was born in 1947, meaning that at the time of her disappearance in 1966, she was just 19 years old. Renee was around 5 foot 9 inches tall with brown hair and hazel eyes, and at the time of her disappearance she was wearing a brown swimsuit with a green and gold floral pattern. Anne Miller was born in 1945, meaning that she was just 21 years old at the time of her disappearance, and she was around 5 foot 2 inches tall with brown hair and blue eyes. And at the time of her disappearance, she was wearing a blue 2-piece swimsuit with a red belt. Now, some of the sources that I read had said that there was allegedly a chance of Anne being around 3 months pregnant at the time of her disappearance, but this wasn't addressed in every single source or confirmed in every source, so I'm not entirely sure whether this could ever be confidently confirmed, but I'll go into that sort of a bit later on in the video. Patricia Blau was born in 1947, so she too was just 19 years old in 1966. She was around 5 foot 4 inches tall and she had brown hair and brown eyes. Patricia was more often known by her nicknames Pat or Patty, and at the time of her disappearance she had been wearing a bright yellow 2-piece swimsuit with ruffles. And on the Charlie Project page dedicated to Patricia, it's also mentioned that she too may have been pregnant in the early stages of pregnancy at the time of her disappearance, although again I couldn't find any solid confirmation of this, so we'll discuss this more later on in the video. The 3 women had met some years before. They had a number of mutual interests. In particular, they were known to have a love of horses. So Renee and Patricia had been in high school together, while Anne then first met Patricia when she was employed at the Oak Brook Polo Club exercising the horses, and so this is how the 3 women met. This case takes place on July the 2nd in 1966, when the 3 women decided to drive up to Indiana Dunes State Park in Indiana. Anne had been the one driving that day, and her first step was to head to Patricia's house on Drury Lane in Westchester, Illinois to pick up her friend. She'd arrived at Patricia's family's house at around 8 AM, and before leaving the house, Patricia had told her mother that they would be home in the early evening before dinner time so that their friend Renee could make it back in time to cook dinner for her husband. Anne and Patricia then headed to Renee's home in West Chicago in Illinois, following which they all then stopped at a local drugstore to pick themselves up some suntan lotion to prepare them for the day. They'd arrived at the Indiana Dunes State Park at around 10 AM that day, and they'd managed to find a spot in the car park to leave their car in the car park that was dedicated to the state park. They collected their belongings from the car and they started a short hike just past the Lake Michigan edge, and they'd eventually found a spot on a part of the beach where there had been a few people but not many other people in the immediate vicinity, although in total there was believed to have been around 9,000 people in the lake area on that day, and so this just seemed like the perfect spot for the 3 to relax for the day where there wasn't too many people in the area. There had also been a couple specifically in the area that had noticed the 3 women placing their bags and belongings on the beach, and they had placed this as being at around 12 PM, and following leaving their belongings on the beach, the couple witnessed the 3 women enter the lake together. This couple then also noticed the 3 women speaking to an unknown male who had been on a large white boat with a blue interior and outboard motor not long after this point. Now obviously all of these sort of sightings from this couple wouldn't have necessarily been anything strange strange, but thankfully the couple that had witnessed these had been vigilant enough to inform park rangers of these sightings later that evening when it started to get dark and late, and they'd noticed that the women's belongings had still been on the same spot at the beach where they had left them earlier that day, and they told them that they hadn't seen these 3 women since this initial sighting. They told the park ranger that they had spoke to that they believed they witnessed the 3 women climbing on board the boat of the unknown male that they were speaking to, and that they'd driven in a westerly direction. And back at the home of the 3 women, their families had all been extremely concerned for the welfare of the women, as they had all planned on returning home earlier on in that day. So like I said, they'd made plans to make it in time for dinner so that one of them could cook for their husband. And as the weekend passed with no sign of the 3 women, the families had filed an official missing persons report. When these reports had been filed with the local authorities, the park ranger who had received a report from the couple who'd noticed the women on the beach had been alerted. The park rangers had started out organising a search of the state park, which is when they discovered Anne Miller's car in the car park where it had been left when they'd arrived just a few days before. The belongings that had been left on the beach were searched, and Anne's car keys were found inside one of the bags, and when the car was then searched, they also found a number of personal belongings of the women inside. The park rangers had been increasingly concerned when they'd found so many of their personal belongings either in the car or in the bags that had been left on the beach for such a long period of time without anyone having come in to claim them, and they decided to contact some other forms of law enforcement, including the Coast Guard, to be able to further the search for the 3 missing women. So this official search had started 3 days after the women had initially arrived at the state park, and they decided to begin seeking out anyone that had been at the state park that day, any potential eyewitness statements that they could gain in order for them to be able to establish a way for them to begin their search. And there were multiple witnesses that provided statements from the day the women were last seen at the beach. One of them in particular had been completely contrasting to the report that had been given by the couple that had initially reported the strange sightings, and kind of completely contradicted their belief timeline. But authorities had been under the impression that this initial report given by the couple had been the most reliable, and although they did take into account the other statements provided, this seemed to be the most useful for them in establishing a timeline of the women's whereabouts that day. Eventually, more and more witness reports began mentioning the man on the white boat and the women having climbed on board. Some reports have stated that the man had been in his early 20s with tan skin and dark wavy hair, which then obviously helped investigators to be able to piece together more details about the timeline. And then a man who had been at the state park that same day, who had been filming clips for some home movies, had offered to provide the clips that he'd managed to film that day to the authorities for them to be able to search any background pieces of information. And after sifting through the footage and searching the background of the clips, they noticed 2 boats that they believed may have been related to these eyewitness statements. One in particular had been determined as a fiberglass 16 to 18 foot trimaran runabout with a 3-hull design, and the man driving the boat appeared to match the description provided by the witness statements. And the other had been a larger boat. It was a 26 to 28 foot Trojan cabin cruiser with 3 men on board and potentially 3 women on board, although it was believed that because of the sort of timings of these video clips having been taken that day, they believed that the women had been on board the smaller boat earlier on in the day and then they'd moved onto the larger cabin cruiser. The timings of the sightings of each of these boats had been around 3 hours apart, with the smaller boat and the women being on board having been at around midday, and then the large boat being at around 3 p.m. The suggested timeline offered by investigators had been that the women may have gotten off the smaller boat and then walked along the beach just before the sighting of the cabin cruiser, so the larger boat, and in this time the driver of the smaller boat had left to retrieve 2 male friends who were later seen on the larger boat with him and the larger boat. This theory had linked to an eyewitness statement that had been given claiming to have witnessed the 3 women walking and eating near the dunes just before 3 p.m, before then being approached by another unknown man and then accompanied to a large cabin cruiser. Bearing in mind though, eyewitness statements can never be fully confirmed as reliable, but authorities are able to sort of use them as potentially reliable statements to be able to build up their sort of timelines, their initial ideas of the whereabouts. It was believed, based on some eyewitness statements, that the cabin cruiser didn't have any names printed on the exterior, so it couldn't really be identified specifically, but it was believed to have had a radio antenna for necessary emergency contact. Around the same time that all of these statements were being collected and pieced together by authorities, they'd also started their search into each of the missing women's backgrounds. Their research led them to believe that there may have been some issues in Renee's marriage, but this being anything drastic or concerning had been completely denied by her family. It was briefly considered that there may have been some criminal activity relating to horse enthusiasts and an illegal horse market. Apparently there had been some minor association with two men known to be linked to this specific illegal activity, but I'll go into a little bit more detail about this sort of later on in the video when I discuss the theories. And allegedly Anne's friends had informed investigators that she was around 3 months pregnant at the time of her disappearance and had confided in her friends that she was considering moving into a home for unwed mothers. But despite her friends having informed authorities of her alleged pregnancy, they weren't ever able to confirm this as a fact by any other means. And aside from this, one of the main focuses of authorities was to consider the possibility of the 3 women having drowned. Patricia's family had told authorities that they didn't believe this was a likely scenario at all, as she was an extremely gifted swimmer who would have been able to swim for a significant distance before struggling even remotely. And both Anne and Renee's family said that they were also relatively strong swimmers, not up to the level of Patricia, but they were still good swimmers, and as much as drowning had been a possible scenario, it did seem like it was increasingly unlikely that all of them would have drowned considering their swimming ability and with there being no sign of remains having washed up anywhere. And aside from the facts that were established in the initial search, little else could be determined by authorities. The boats that the women were believed to have been seen on were never tracked down, and any other sightings of women in later years could never be confirmed either. There had been a discovery of some debris from a potential boat wreckage found not long after the disappearances in the same sort of area, but this couldn't specifically be linked to the case either. So what I want to do from here is just go into some of the theories that I've seen floating about online, because there is obviously a lot of potential scenarios that could be suggested relating to these women's disappearances. So as I said, one of the most logical explanations would be that the women had drowned in Lake Michigan while swimming. It was a potentially dangerous place to swim because of strong currents that can appear very suddenly and very quickly, and there have been numerous drownings in Lake Michigan. But as I said, there had been no signs of any remains having been discovered since the disappearance, as well as the fact that the 3 were believed to be particularly strong swimmers. There would have likely been a sighting from one of the numerous people on the nearby beach if someone was at risk of drowning, especially since they had only been swimming just slightly offshore and not very far out at all. And the subsequent search carried out by the Coast Guard in the following investigation would have likely found something if this had been the case, and so it does seem like an increasingly unlikely scenario. Another explored scenario had been that 3 women had chosen to disappear and start a new life somewhere completely. This theory is often considered when investigators begin to look into any potential troubles that might have been happening at home, and with the belief that there was potentially 1 or maybe 2 unwanted pregnancies and potential problems in a marriage, it was believed that this could be a possibility at the time. As I mentioned briefly, there had allegedly been an issue relating to horse syndicate people, more specifically that Anne was having trouble with them in the months prior. Essentially, this whole issue relates to someone killing a horse in order to collect the insurance money, and Anne was believed to have had a run-in with a man named Silas Jane relating to an incident of this, and it was proposed that he had threatened the women who had knowledge of this illegal activity of him taking part in this horse insurance scam, and as a result the women may have attempted to start a new life in safety. But also linking to this, some have even gone as far as to propose that he may have even been successful in actually hurting these women in order to protect his secret. These scenarios are arguably far-fetched, but there isn't a lot. These scenarios are arguably far-fetched and there isn't really a lot to support them, but it has still been something that is taken into consideration. And linking more specifically to the theories of the women having been murdered by Silas Jane or someone on behalf of him, there have been a number of suggested theories relating to this specifically. One of interest had linked specifically to the small bits of unidentifiable boat wreckage debris that had been found in the area not long after the disappearances. Some have suggested that the women may have been held on an unidentifiable boat some distance away from where anyone would have seen or heard them, and the perpetrators had ignited an explosion in an attempt to hide any remains of the women and mask it as a boating accident. And this would have been something that was difficult for authorities to determine at the time, since there had been limited to no means of investigating this from like a forensic perspective, but it has been suggested as a scenario. Although it does seem unlikely that no one would have taken any suspicion suspicion if this had been the case. So like someone noticing an explosion in the distance, or the women being taken on board a boat against their will, it would have been likely that someone would have noticed this. Although some have even gone as far as to suggest that the women may have gotten onto the boat voluntarily, being completely unaware that the men on each of the boats had been associates of Silas Jane. Another theory had been that since there had been no reports of any missing boats in the area at the time of the disappearances, the man driving the boat had just simply been joyriding the vehicle and the women had chosen to join him. But then something had happened and they'd crashed and sank, and none of the remains had ever been found. And like some of the others though, this does seem unlikely, as the search for the women afterwards would have likely found some sort of evidence of this occurring if this had been the case. A slightly different theory to one of the previous had been that the man seen with the women had not been an associate of Silas Jane, but he had been a serial killer and he had lured them to danger under false pretenses. And a slightly more far-fetched theory that some people do believe is likely is that the women had arranged to meet someone on a houseboat on Lake Michigan so that one of them could undergo an abortion. Now, this theory suggests that the illegal abortion had faced some unexpected issues, and as a result one of the women had died, and the perpetrator had then murdered the other two in order to prevent anyone else from discovering what had happened. I do think this is rather far-fetched, as there isn't a lot of information to support it. It's more one of those theories that has been chucked about online, and some people have questioned why the women would have left all of their belongings on the beach if they had planned to go to this appointment. It was also suggested that the women may have walked too far through the dunes and died as a result of sinking into one of them, which has happened previously in extremely unfortunate accidents, but again, I don't think there's a lot of evidence to support this, but it is a possible scenario. And so that is everything I have to discuss today. I'd definitely be interested in hearing your guys' thoughts on each of the theories, or whether you have one of your own. I know this is definitely talked about quite a lot. I saw a lot of theories thrown around, but as with cases that don't have a lot of indication of where they could have gone or who could have taken them, a lot of the theories are just down to speculation, and so there isn't a lot of solid evidence, but I'd definitely be interested in hearing your guys' thoughts down below. And so yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting, and I'll see you guys very soon for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.